Sometimes things just come around, you know? A couple of months ago, I was planning on making a video about Crash Bandicoot. I had it all planned out and written, and I thought it was pretty good. And then the morning I was gonna record it, the news story hit about the piñatas and other Crash-themed gifts that were being given to a select few people in the industry. Without going too much into detail, that story kind of instantly dated my video. There may have still been some merit to what I was saying, but some of it was also debunked by these gifts, so I decided to scrap the video and feel bad about the fact that I'd wasted 2 days of scripting for absolutely nothing. The universe decided to balance itself this week though, when I planned to make a video on why inFAMOUS should be continued, rebooted, remade, anything, and the next day we got a rumor from a somewhat prominent figure in the games industry which claimed that inFAMOUS and Sly Cooper were in fact returning. We've already heard rumblings and seen domains being renewed, so we had an inkling that this might be happening, but this is probably the best indication so far that this is a real thing. I don't know how far along this new inFAMOUS game is, or if it even exists. You never know, sources can be wrong. But given how inFAMOUS is another one of those games that's among the first batch of titles I properly played as a kid, and those games are responsible for shaping a lot of what I like, I felt compelled to talk about it because even though the last time we saw a proper entry in this series was over 7 years ago, this is a franchise that stays fresh in my mind at all times. I wanted to talk about not only why I think inFAMOUS deserves to be given a second chance to shine, but also how I think it could improve its formula and tweak it to make it even more satisfying to play now than it was back then. A lot of games throughout the years have given themselves some kind of a comic edge. There's Comic Zone, 13, Borderlands, Gex. He's certainly quite the comic. To me though, I've always associated comic-style visuals with inFAMOUS, even though most of the game is not in this style. I'm a massive fan of when certain moments in a game or movie or show use a different, unique animation technique to distinguish that section a little bit from the rest of what you're seeing. The first time I saw something like this, it was that Deathly Hallows animation section from Harry Potter, and it instantly became my favorite part of the movie. I just think it's awesome when you get a short, stylized story inside of another story, and inFAMOUS was great at this. One thing that makes me sad about Second Son, even though I do love that game, is that Sucker Punch only used that unique 2D comic animation style to give backstories to the conduits you were meeting. I think it was always cool that you could turn the other games into like a short animated film with just these sections and you could get the majority of the story that way, and not having something like that in this game is something that did bum me out a little bit when it came out. I hope that if the franchise does continue, they lean a little bit more into earlier inFAMOUS games with regards to this element. Most of the time these scenes were just exposition, but if you can make exposition fun, then by all means explain away. inFAMOUS doesn't just feel like a comic book because of its visuals though. The storyline and lore around this franchise feel pretty damn reminiscent to what you might find in the pages of a graphic novel. And maybe that's just a little too true, because if you boil the story down to the essentials, it's about a group of seemingly normal people who have dormant abilities which unlock at a certain point, giving them unique powers that terrify the rest of the world, so they're shunned and treated like terrorists and enemies of the state just for being different. And hey, wait a minute. Okay, so in some ways, it's kinda just X-Men, let's be honest. But inFAMOUS is usually more centralized on one character, with the supporting cast being in the background rather than emphasizing a team dynamic, and the world around you just seems a lot dirtier and more run-in. Plus, even though the premise is similar, there's some really cool original lore here that I like a lot. inFAMOUS has its fair share of zany comicness. Wait, the beast that I'm fighting is actually my best friend who I thought died in an explosion? The villain is me but from the future, and so I'm the one that gave myself these powers? Oh, what? But that's what makes it so appealing. When inFAMOUS 1 and 2 came out, it felt like you were getting a brand new comic book collected edition alongside a brand new video game. And there's really not a lot of other things that you could say that about. Even Second Son kinda moved away from that idea, and I think that's part of why people were just a tad bit less warm to that game compared to the first two. If you think about it, even though superhero games are getting better overall and more consistent, etc., there aren't too many original superhero games. Ones that aren't based on properties that have existed for dozens of years and originate in a medium other than video games. The upcoming Midnight Suns, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man, Avengers, Batman Arkham, Suicide Squad, I might be wrong here, but the only games that come to mind that fit the bill of superhero game without adapting established IPs are inFAMOUS and Prototype, and I guess you could also say something like Saints Row 4, although not the whole franchise. And all of those games have been out of commission for a really long while now. There's something truly special about Sucker Punch's sometimes campy, sometimes gritty, sometimes off-the-wall, insane insane rendition of their own original superhero story. And probably above all else, this is what I'm hoping for if the franchise returns. I think inFAMOUS's identity shifted just a tiny bit with Second Son, and it felt more like a normal game as far as its presentation and story beats went, and that's fine. But I think there's a well of potential here that would be kind of foolish to leave untapped if you were to return to this franchise. In my Solar Ash video, I talked about how big movement is getting in games. It's becoming a lot more common to just have fun moving and jumping and gliding across a map. And I think a modern inFAMOUS game would end up being one of the best examples of this because its foundation on that front from the original games is really solid. Parkour in the inFAMOUS games is pretty sophisticated in terms of always having the ability to free run up a building. Structures are well designed around that idea, and the game allows you to squeeze onto some really thin surfaces. But I will say that this part of traversal is also kinda stilted. You wind up having to spam the jump button quite a bit and slowly hop up buildings, which doesn't match the pace of your regular movement or flight, and I think there's a simple fix to this, but I think I'll touch more on that in the last section where I discuss how the game could modernize itself. For now though, this might be a little bit on the rough side, but the other elements to the traversal were a lot smoother and more enjoyable. Zipping up electric lines or surfing electrical wires, which Mario Odyssey stole, so I feel like this is the only natural conclusion we can draw from that. Dashing through or flinging upwards from vents, mid-air dashing, hover flight, bursts of neon speed or super jumps turning into cannon bolts. There's so many ways to get around in these games, especially in Second Son, and I think that's a really underrated part of this franchise. It was really fun to move around even if the cities themselves weren't exceptionally special. Combat in these games is still a lot of fun today. I don't know if I mentioned this, but for this video I did go back and play inFAMOUS 2 via PS Now and inFAMOUS Second Son via regular game in preparation, just to remind myself of the things that I'd maybe forgotten, and actually playing through them was a lot of fun, even though my internet half the time made inFAMOUS 2 look like it was running at 30p 3 frames per second. Sucker Punch did a good job though of building up your powers and allowing you to do fun stuff like tossing cars at people or turning into a living missile or yeeting a bunch of video birds at people that apparently subdue them. Yeah. Okay, but they definitely got a lot out of your powers in combat. I didn't always like how you had to replenish your abilities as often as you did, because even though I get why they do that, sometimes, especially in Second Son, I feel like you have moments where you're running around aimlessly in a big fight looking for smoke, and for whatever reason you can't find it, and that's annoying. But honestly, in the grand scheme of things, that's a super minor complaint. I like how even though the base of the combat is pretty similar for all of your powers, actually firing lightning versus firing smoke versus neon versus video versus concrete doesn't feel all that different aside from sometimes the rate of fire. They still made sure that there were some parts of the base combat which let you differentiate between everything and have a different focus when you were using a different kind of weapon. Like for example, if you had smoke and you got one of the good karma upgrades early on, you were able to headshot people and stun them for a little bit and go in for the subdue, which is usually what you wanted to do to everyone since it stopped the person from shooting at you for a bit, it required the least amount of shots if you did it right, and it helped you bring up your good karma and build up your super powerful smoke attack. Once you got the neon powers though, it had a base ability where if you aimed down, it would instantly subdue or execute enemies if you shot them in a specific spot. Leg for subdue, which gave you good karma, and head for execution, which gave you bad karma. And so your focus shifted to a completely different part of the enemy's body when you flipped back and forth between the powers. It's not anything massive, but it was stuff like this and some of the differences in their L1 attacks or what situations each power's super was most useful in that gave the game the variety it needed. Still, I think there's room for this stuff to become even more interesting, and if I'm gonna do a video about why this game deserves to be revived, I think it makes sense to talk about how a new game could actually improve on what was done in the past. So in this last section, let's discuss what a new inFAMOUS game could potentially look like. I'm gonna hope that if a new inFAMOUS game comes out, it's gonna be a sequel and not a remake or reboot of some kind, and that means it's not gonna follow Cole McGrath or Delson Rowe. My guess is that we're getting something new, and as far as the story or anything like that goes, my only hope is that they manage to give it the same comic feel as the old games, and after that, do what you want, run wild. The stories in these games are not their selling point, but give us something kind of engaging with a cool presentation, and that's really all I need. As far as the gameplay goes though, there are some minor improvements that I think could really make a potential new game feel very fluid, and some other fun ideas that I had that you could run with to make something really interesting. Most of the minor improvements I think are going to come down to the traversal. Second Son did away a bit with the parkour in general by adding vents or allowing some powers to just shoot you up a wall, but it was still sometimes necessary to clamber up buildings, especially early on. And these games do like to emphasize that their characters are big parkour experts before they got their powers, so it would feel a little bit empty without this element. One possible way to incorporate parkour without it feeling like the slowest and most sluggish part of movement is to infuse the parkour with your powers. You don't necessarily have to pull a Spider-Man or a Neon Dash, which let you use your powers to avoid climbing altogether, but you could maybe do a powered up version of the Catwoman traversal mechanic from Arkham City. I'm gonna explain what I mean here, but keep in mind I obviously don't have footage of this, so you're gonna have to use your imagination, and I guess the same goes for a lot of this section. Say you were parkouring and you currently had smoke abilities equipped. I'm assuming that you won't have smoke in a potential new game, but let's just use that as an example. There can be some cool animations for when you launch off of stuff, like you kick a wall or you swing off flagpoles or something, which give it that free run feel. But then you also allow the character to leap massive distances easily by incorporating a smoke dash as part of the leap. It's like power parkour, best of both worlds, and it can also have some timing elements like the Catwoman system has that make it feel even better when you pull it off properly. I think that would make this game feel really distinct, because usually with games like this you either just have to hold the stick in a certain direction and the game will do the work for you, or you just ignore handholds altogether and run up walls. But if Infamous wants to have that parkour edge, I think that a more fleshed out system would do a lot of good. That's for traversal going upwards, but what about traversal going across? Well, that's kind of where I think you need to take notes from games like Spider-Man and Batman Arkham and realize that it's the most enjoyable to move around when you can make everything feel like one big, long, fluid motion. I think it would be really cool if in a new Infamous game you had the ability to pull yourself towards and stick onto sides of walls for a brief moment, and doing that would reset your dash or other in-air abilities so you could just spring back up off the wall and then continue your aerial traversal. Either that, or you could better preserve motion when a character lands on the ground or on a rooftop so you can keep running fast and launch yourself upwards back into aerial traversal, and obviously that would be taking a lot of influence from the Spider-Man games. Anything that allows you to maintain your airtime is essential. Not only dashing or hovering, but some rendition of that aerial boost Venom move from Miles Morales would be really great. Or maybe you could dive into the ground and use that energy to immediately fling yourself back up with a lot of force. I'm kind of just spitballing here, but there's tons of ways to use powers to expand traversal, and we're at a point with games now where we're seeing how far that idea can be taken, and I'd love to see Infamous be part of that process. As for combat, this is where I feel a new game can really show just how much more potential this series has. If the game winds up giving you multiple powers like Second Son did, I think that a wise choice would be to make these powers more specialized. Everything in the original 3 games is an assault rifle with some alt-fire methods, which just isn't gonna cut it this time around. It might be tough to outdo Second Son in terms of the sheer amount of attacks and abilities that each power has, so instead of trying to expand outwards and add more and more, maybe rein it in a little bit and instead specialize each power to fit more specific purposes. One can still be more assault rifle based, but one can be better for trapping enemies and crowd control. I think it would be really cool if one of them was like a shoddy sniper. Say you had laser powers and you could do powerful short range blasts with lots of spread, or you could focus all of that energy into one specific powerful shot that was really precise, but you couldn't do anything in between. Or maybe you get metal powers and it specializes in melee, having no ranged options, but you could change between a sword or an axe or a lance with different movesets that are all more effective against different enemies. There's a whole lot of room here to expand on what these games did without trying to simply outdo what you did last time. If the devs decide not to go the multiple powers route and instead there's a singular focus, I think it would be really great to have magnetic powers. That would allow the players to use the environment a lot more, ripping down light poles and flinging manhole covers into enemies. Powers like this could actually make most of the combat environmental based, which would be really unique and unlike anything we've seen before. Though in fairness, it would be really tough to pull this off. A natural issue would also be that the player could potentially run out of things to use in certain areas and essentially soft lock themselves and need to restart checkpoints. But you could also solve that problem by having some basic attacks that you could never run out of. Like if you wanted to do some kind of assault rifle thing here as well, maybe your character keeps coins in his pocket that you could send flying at high velocities, and you could also call them back so they boomerang back to you. Or alternatively, you could pick up coins and paper clips and other metal items off the ground the same way that you drain things for power in the old games, and then you could launch those things as your attack, and you need to go around the area replenishing them like you do in the original games. Again, lots of options, but if they choose to pick one power to focus on, I think both for interesting karma choices and for varied gameplay opportunities, something like magnetism or telekinesis would be the best way to go. Infamous is a series which has almost nothing holding it back. It's not afraid to switch protagonists, and it's not afraid to give you any power set you could imagine, and that means that its potential is positively through the roof. I could see an Infamous game that goes back to its electricity roots, and I can also see one that involves powers that we wouldn't think of in a million years. I could see a version of the game where it embraces its X-Men influences and it gives you multiple characters with really different powers. Maybe even letting you play co-op, although hopefully not as a live service game. Really, I could see about 100 different ways a new Infamous game could possibly go, and I think that's the biggest reason why it deserves a second life. We've seen nowhere near the limits of this original world with its own lore that's running amok with super-powered people. And because it's not based in comics or TV shows, it's able to introduce any enemies it wants, any massive world-shifting events, anything. Infamous can basically do anything. And I say we let it. Thanks for watching, guys. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, leave a sub if you're new, leave a comment if you're feeling spicy, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.